There was a time when marriage vows meant forever, when couples fought through every storm together rather than walking away at the first sign of trouble. But what happened on Family Feud one Tuesday afternoon in September 2024 would remind everyone watching that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to hold on and when the marriage is worth saving. When Steve Harvey heard what contestant Margaret Williams had just revealed on live television, even he, a man who had seen everything in his decades of hosting, couldn't hide his shock. The studio fell silent. The cameras kept rolling. And what unfolded next would restore your faith in the power of truth, vulnerability, and second chances. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you believe in the power of love and redemption, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Margaret Williams was 52 years old, though the stress of the past year had added lines to her face that made her look older. She stood on the Family Feud stage wearing a simple navy blue dress, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from shaking. Next to her stood her husband of 28 years, Robert Williams, a man who had once been her high school sweetheart but now felt like a stranger living in her house. The Williams family from Richmond, Virginia, had been selected to compete on Family Feud after their daughter Ashley had submitted an application months earlier. Ashley, their 26-year-old middle child, thought the experience might bring her fractured family together, even if just for a few days. She had no idea that her mother was carrying a secret that would explode on national television. Margaret had grown up in a small town in West Virginia, the daughter of a coal miner who had worked himself into an early grave to provide for his family. Her mother had raised 4 children alone after her father died when Margaret was just 14. She had learned early that love meant sacrifice, that marriage meant endurance, and that you never gave up on family no matter how hard things became. She had met Robert when she was 16 years old at a church youth group. He was kind, ambitious, and promised her a life better than the one she had known. They married young, just 19 years old, and built a life together in Richmond where Robert worked as an accountant and Margaret became a schoolteacher. They had 3 children, bought a modest house in a good neighborhood, and from the outside they looked like the picture of middle-class success. But behind closed doors, their marriage had been slowly dying for years. Robert had become consumed by his work, often staying at the office until late into the night. He missed family dinners, school events, anniversaries. Margaret had raised their children essentially as a single mother while maintaining a full-time teaching career. She had swallowed her loneliness, her resentment, her growing sense that she had somehow become invisible in her own marriage. The breaking point had come 6 months earlier when Margaret discovered that Robert had been having an emotional affair with a colleague at his firm. There had been no physical relationship, but the thousands of text messages, the secret phone calls, the intimate conversations he had been having with another woman while barely speaking to his own wife had shattered something fundamental in Margaret's heart. For months, she had tried to make it work. They had gone to counseling, though Robert attended reluctantly and often canceled sessions due to work commitments. Margaret had read books on saving marriages, had tried to reignite the romance, had done everything she could think of to rebuild what they had lost. But Robert seemed checked out, going through the motions of reconciliation without any real emotional investment. 3 days before the Family Feud taping, Margaret had finally made the decision that had been building in her heart for months. She had walked into a lawyer's office and filed for divorce. She had not told Robert yet. She had not told her children. The papers were sitting in her purse in the dressing room backstage, waiting to be served. She had almost canceled the Family Feud appearance. How could she stand on stage and pretend to be a happy family when she was about to blow their world apart? But Ashley had been so excited, had talked about it for months, and Margaret could not bring herself to disappoint her daughter. She told herself she could make it through one taping, smile for the cameras, and then deal with the reality of her crumbling marriage when they got home. What Margaret did not know was that the game show appearance she had agreed to as a favor to her daughter was about to become the catalyst for the most honest conversation she and Robert had had in years. The Williams family had made it through the first few rounds of Family Feud without incident. They were competing against the Henderson family from Ohio, and both teams were evenly matched. Margaret had contributed some solid answers, staying focused on the game and not letting her personal turmoil show on her face. Robert stood at the end of the family line, his arms crossed, his expression distant. Their children, Ashley, 26, Michael, 23, and Sarah, 19, filled the space between them, literally and figuratively. Steve Harvey worked his way down the line during a break in the action, doing what he did best, connecting with the families and finding the stories that made each contestant human and relatable. When he reached Margaret, something in her eyes made him pause. He had interviewed thousands of contestants over the years, and he had developed an instinct for when someone was carrying more weight than they were showing. "Margaret, you've been married to Robert for how long?" Steve asked, his voice warm and encouraging. Margaret's smile was practiced and did not reach her eyes. 28 years, Steve. 28 years, that's beautiful, Steve said, nodding appreciatively. What's the secret to making it that long? It was meant to be a softball question, the kind of lighthearted banter that filled the spaces between game play. But something in Margaret broke in that moment. Maybe it was the exhaustion of pretending. Maybe it was the absurdity of being asked about the secret to her marriage when divorce papers were sitting in her purse. Maybe it was simply that after months of silence, she could not hold the truth inside anymore. "Actually, Steve," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I filed for divorce yesterday." The studio went completely silent. Steve Harvey, a man famous for his quick wit and ability to handle any situation, stood frozen with his mouth slightly open, his microphone hanging loosely in his hand. The camera operators kept filming, unsure whether to cut away. The studio audience gasped collectively, and somewhere in the producer's booth, someone was frantically trying to decide whether this was television gold or a disaster that needed to be stopped. Robert's head snapped toward his wife, his face draining of color. Their children stood paralyzed, looking between their parents in shock and confusion. Ashley, who had organized this trip as a way to bring her family together, looked like she might be sick. Steve recovered first, his professional instincts kicking in even as his personal shock remained evident on his face. "I'm sorry, Margaret. Did you just say what I think you said?" Margaret nodded, tears beginning to stream down her face, ruining the makeup the show's team had carefully applied that morning. "I filed for divorce yesterday. The papers are in my purse backstage. Robert doesn't know yet. The kids don't know. Nobody knows except my lawyer and now all of you watching." The studio erupted in murmurs and whispers. Steve held up his hand, signaling for quiet, for respect for the space this moment deserved. He looked at Robert, whose face had gone from shock to something that looked like agony. "Robert," Steve said gently, "did you have any idea?" Robert shook his head, his eyes locked on his wife's face as if seeing her for the first time in years. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "I mean, I knew we were having problems. I knew Margaret was unhappy, but I thought we were working on it. I thought we still had time." Steve turned back to Margaret. "Can you tell us what happened? You don't have to, but something tells me you need to get this out." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, no longer caring about the cameras or the audience or the fact that this was being broadcast to millions of people. "For the past 5 years, I have felt invisible in my own marriage," she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Robert works constantly. He misses everything that matters: our anniversary, school plays, family dinners. I raised our children alone while he built his career. And 6 months ago, I found out he was having an emotional affair with a woman from his office." The audience gasped again. Robert closed his eyes as if in pain. Their children stood frozen, processing this information that was news to them as well. Margaret continued, "We went to counseling. I read every book. I tried everything I could think of to save our marriage, but Robert never really tried. He showed up to therapy when it was convenient. He said the right words, but nothing changed. I finally realized that I was fighting for a marriage all by myself, and I couldn't do it anymore." Steve Harvey, visibly moved by Margaret's raw honesty, turned to Robert. "What do you have to say to that?" Robert looked at his wife, at this woman he had known since she was 16 years old, and for the first time in years really saw her. He saw the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion in her shoulders, the loneliness that had become so familiar she wore it like a second skin. "She's right," Robert said, and his admission seemed to surprise even himself. "Everything she said is right. I did check out. I did prioritize my work over my family. I told myself I was providing for them, that working hard was how I showed love, but the truth is I was hiding. The affair with Susan, it wasn't physical, but Margaret's right, it was real. I was sharing parts of myself with another woman that I should have been sharing with my wife." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "When Margaret said we needed counseling, I was defensive. I thought she was overreacting. I showed up to the sessions, but I didn't really engage. I thought if I just waited it out, things would go back to normal. I didn't realize that normal was the problem. Normal was us living like roommates instead of partners. Normal was me taking her for granted every single day." The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Every person in that audience was watching a marriage unravel in real time, and yet there was something sacred about the honesty of the moment. Steve looked between Margaret and Robert, then at their 3 children who were all crying now. "Kids, do you want to say anything?" Ashley, the oldest, stepped forward slightly. Mom, Dad, I organized this trip because I could see you were struggling. I thought maybe if we did something fun together, something that got us out of our regular routine, you might remember why you fell in love. I had no idea it had gotten this bad. Michael, their son, spoke next. Dad, I love you, but Mom's right. You were never there. Every baseball game, every school event, it was always Mom. I used to make excuses for you, tell myself you were working hard for us, but at some point I realized you were choosing to be absent. Sarah, the youngest, was crying too hard to speak at first. When she finally found her voice, she said, I don't want you to get divorced, but I also don't want you to be this unhappy, Mom. You deserve better than this. Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over a decade. He had seen emotional moments, funny moments, shocking moments, but he had never seen anything quite like this. A marriage falling apart on his stage, the raw vulnerability of a family in crisis, and somehow, in the midst of it all, the possibility of redemption. He made a decision in that moment that went against every standard game show protocol. I'm going to do something we've never done before, Steve announced. We're going to stop the game, we're going to take a break, and we're going to give this family some time and space to talk. Robert, Margaret, kids, there's a room backstage. I want you to go there. I want you to talk to each other, really talk, maybe for the first time in a long time. Take as much time as you need. The producers initially panicked, but Steve's authority on his own show was absolute. The Williams family was ushered backstage to a quiet room away from the cameras and the audience. For 30 minutes they talked. They cried. They said things that had been left unsaid for years. Robert finally broke down the walls he had built around himself. He admitted that his workaholism was a way of avoiding the intimacy and vulnerability that real marriage required. He confessed that after years of feeling inadequate as a husband and father, it had been easier to throw himself into work where he felt competent and successful rather than face his failures at home. He told Margaret about the fears he had never voiced, about how his own father had abandoned his family when Robert was young, and how he had promised himself he would never do that. But in trying so hard not to abandon his family financially, he had abandoned them emotionally instead. Margaret, for her part, admitted that she had shut down too. She had stopped communicating her needs clearly because she was tired of feeling like she was begging for basic attention and affection. She had allowed resentment to build up instead of addressing problems when they were still manageable. She acknowledged that her decision to file for divorce had been made in isolation, without giving Robert one final real chance to understand how serious things had become. Their children shared their own pain, their own experiences of growing up in a household where their parents were together but not truly connected. They talked about the impact it had on their own views of love and marriage, their own fears about relationships. It was the most honest their family had been with each other in years, possibly ever. And in that honesty, something began to shift. It was not a miracle cure. It was not a sudden resolution of years of problems. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall that had been built between them. When they finally emerged from the room and returned to the stage, the audience was still there, waiting. Steve Harvey stood at the ready, clearly moved by whatever he had been told about what had transpired backstage. So, Steve said gently when they had taken their places back on stage, do you want to tell everyone what you talked about? Robert spoke first. I asked Margaret not to serve those divorce papers, not because I think everything is suddenly fixed, but because I realize now that I never really fought for our marriage. I showed up to counseling, but I didn't show up emotionally. I want a real chance to save this. Not a half-hearted attempt, but a real commitment to becoming the husband and father I should have been all along. Margaret, her hand now clasped in Robert's for the first time in months, added, I agreed to hold off on the divorce, but I was very clear with Robert that this is his last chance. We're going to do intensive counseling. He's going to make real changes in his work-life balance. We're going to rebuild trust slowly. And if he falls back into old patterns, I won't give him another chance. I've learned that I deserve better than crumbs of attention and affection. Steve nodded approvingly. That sounds like wisdom to me. Marriage isn't about never having problems. It's about whether both people are willing to do the work to solve them. Robert, I want to ask you something directly. Are you willing to do that work? Yes, Robert said without hesitation. I've spent 28 years taking Margaret for granted. I've spent 28 years putting everything else before her. If she's willing to give me another chance, I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that she didn't make a mistake. Steve turned to the audience. I want to say something to everyone watching. What we just witnessed here is what real marriage looks like. It's not always pretty. It's not always easy. Sometimes it means having the hard conversations we've been avoiding. Sometimes it means admitting we've failed. But when both people are willing to be honest, when both people are willing to change, there's hope. He looked back at the Williams family. Now, I know we're in the middle of a game show here, and technically we should get back to Family Feud. But I think we've all learned something more valuable than any prize money could buy. So here's what we're going to do. Whether you win or lose this game, Anthropic's Family Feud is going to pay for 1 year of intensive marriage counseling for you too. We're going to give you every resource we can to help you rebuild your marriage. The audience erupted in applause. Margaret began crying again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and relief. Robert pulled her into an embrace, and their children gathered around them in a group hug that felt different from any hug their family had shared before. This one was real, raw, and full of hope. The Williams family did end up finishing the game, though no one really cared about the score anymore. They lost to the Henderson family, but as they walked off stage, they felt like they had won something far more valuable. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was unprecedented. Within hours of the broadcast, the clip of Margaret's confession had gone viral. But unlike typical viral moments that fade quickly, this one sparked a national conversation about marriage, honesty, and what it really takes to make relationships work. Marriage counselors reported a surge in couples seeking help, many of them citing Margaret's courage in speaking her truth as inspiration to address their own struggling relationships. The Williams family kept their commitment to intensive counseling. Robert made significant changes in his career, turning down a promotion that would have required even more hours, and instead focusing on being present for his family. Margaret worked through years of resentment and learned to communicate her needs clearly rather than expecting Robert to read her mind. It was not easy. There were setbacks and difficult moments. 3 months into counseling, Robert slipped back into old patterns during a particularly stressful project at work, and Margaret had to remind him firmly that she was serious about her boundaries. There were nights when old hurts resurfaced, and they had to work through painful conversations. But this time, both of them were truly committed to the process. 6 months after the episode aired, Steve Harvey invited the Williams family back for a follow-up segment. The transformation was visible. Robert and Margaret sat close together, their body language open and connected in a way it had not been during the first taping. Their children reported that their parents actually seemed happy together, that their house felt like a home again rather than a place where people coexisted in separate orbits. The biggest change, Margaret told Steve during the follow-up, is that Robert is present now, not just physically but emotionally. He comes home for dinner. He asks about my day and actually listens to the answer. He planned a weekend away for just the two of us, the first time we've done that in years. These might seem like small things, but they're everything, Robert added. I realized that I had been living my life on autopilot, checking boxes and telling myself I was being a good husband and father because I provided financially. But Margaret and the kids didn't need a paycheck. They needed me. The irony is that I'm actually more successful at work now because I'm not using it as an escape. I'm more focused, more efficient, and I leave at a reasonable hour because I have something worth going home to. Steve was visibly moved by their progress. When Margaret stood on this stage and said she had filed for divorce, I think everyone watching thought this marriage was over. What made you decide to fight for it? Margaret thought for a moment before answering. Honestly, I think it was seeing Robert's face when I told him. For the first time in years, I saw real emotion, real pain, real understanding of what he had done. And then hearing him admit everything, not making excuses or getting defensive, just owning his failures, that showed me there was still something worth saving. She continued, but I also want to be clear. I didn't just stay because he promised to change. I stayed because he actually did change. If he had gone back to his old patterns after a few weeks, I would have served those papers. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from something that's destroying you. In our case, we were both willing to do the work, so staying was the right choice. But it's not always the right choice for everyone. The follow-up segment ended with the Williams family playing a redemption round of fast money. This time, the tension from the first taping was gone, replaced by genuine teamwork and support. They won $20,000, which they donated to a marriage counseling nonprofit that provided services to low-income couples who could not afford therapy. Over the following years, Margaret and Robert became unexpected advocates for marriage counseling and honest communication. They spoke at churches and community centers, sharing their story and encouraging other couples to seek help before reaching the breaking point. They were always careful to emphasize that their story was not prescriptive, that sometimes divorce was the right and necessary choice, but that if both people were willing to do real work, healing was possible. Their children later said that their parents' crisis and subsequent healing had profoundly impacted their own approaches to relationships. Ashley, who was engaged when the Family Feud taping happened, decided to do premarital counseling with her fiancé, determined to build strong communication patterns from the beginning. Michael became more intentional about being emotionally available in his own relationships. Sarah, the youngest, said watching her parents' marriage nearly end, and then Heel taught her that love was not just a feeling, but a choice you made every day. Steve Harvey often referenced the Williams family in his talks about relationships and marriage. Their story became one of his most powerful examples of the importance of honest communication and the possibility of redemption. He kept in touch with them over the years, checking in periodically and celebrating their continued progress. 5 years after that fateful Family Feud taping, Robert and Margaret renewed their wedding vows in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. Steve Harvey flew in to officiate, calling it an honor to be part of their journey. In his remarks during the ceremony, he said something that captured the essence of their story. 5 years ago, I watched a marriage nearly end on my stage. Margaret stood up there and said words that I never expected to hear on Family Feud. But what happened next reminded me that sometimes the end is actually a beginning. Sometimes you have to face the truth of where you are before you can get to where you need to be. Robert and Margaret, you didn't just save your marriage. You rebuilt it into something stronger and more honest than it was before. That's not just inspiring, that's transformational. Margaret and Robert's story became part of Family Feud lore, referenced in articles about the most emotional moments in game show history. But for them, the real legacy was not their viral fame or their impact on others. It was the daily choice they made to choose each other, to communicate honestly, to show up for each other in ways both big and small. They often reflected on how close they had come to losing everything. The divorce papers Margaret had filed were never served and were eventually withdrawn. They sat framed in their counselor's office as a reminder of where they had been and how far they had come. Margaret sometimes thought about the version of herself who had walked into that lawyer's office, exhausted and certain that divorce was the only answer. She felt compassion for that woman while also feeling grateful that she had been given one more chance to fight for what mattered. Robert, for his part, never forgot the feeling of standing on that stage and hearing his wife say she had filed for divorce. It was the wake-up call he had desperately needed but had been too blind to see coming. He kept a photo from the Family Feud taping on his desk at work, not as a memory of their game show appearance, but as a reminder of what he had almost lost and why his family would always come first. The story of Margaret Williams and her shocking revelation on Family Feud remains a powerful testament to the complexity of marriage, the courage required for honest communication, and the possibility of redemption when both people are willing to do the work. It reminds us that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is tell the truth, even when it is painful, even when it feels like the truth might destroy everything. Because only in truth can we find real healing and real connection. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of what matters most in relationships, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear that it is never too late to fight for what you love, or to walk away from what is destroying you. Either way, your story matters, your truth matters, and you deserve relationships built on honesty, respect, and genuine connection. Margaret often said in her talks to other couples that the worst day of her marriage, standing on that stage and revealing her filed divorce papers, became the beginning of the best chapter of their relationship. Not because the problems magically disappeared, but because they finally stopped pretending and started being real with each other. And in that realness, they found their way back to the love that had brought them together in the first place, only now it was deeper, more mature, and built on a foundation of truth rather than pretense. The Family Feud stage had witnessed their near ending, but it had also witnessed their new beginning. And that perhaps is the real moral of this story, that endings and beginnings are often not as separate as we think, that sometimes we have to let one version of our relationship die so that a healthier version can be born, and that the courage to speak our truth, even when our voice shakes, can be the very thing that saves us.